In November 2012, a research vessel called the Southern Surveyor sailed directly over an island, Sandy Island. It appeared on nautical charts. It appeared in oceanographic databases. It appeared in Google's geographic system. It was listed in the CIA World Factbook. France had formally claimed it. The crew checked their instruments. Depth 4,600 feet. There was no island. Sandy Island had existed on official maps for 136 years. It was never there. Before assuming this is an anomaly, understand something more uncomfortable. For 500 years, the maps that shaped empires, redirected armies, justified sovereignty, and divided continents contained places that did not exist. Mountains no one could cross because they weren't there. Passages that drove expeditions because someone drew a line. Islands copied across centuries because a document had authority. This is not a story about bad navigation. It is about what happens when institutions trust the document more than the ground, and what gets built permanently on top of that trust. Here is the first correction. Pre-modern maps were not neutral tools. They were political instruments. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. A line was drawn across oceans not fully crossed, over continents not fully mapped. The map preceded the territory, and that created structural pressure. Blank space on a map meant weakness. If you were the Spanish crown and a rival published your coastline as undefined, terra incognita, that implied you did not control what you claimed. If you were a cartographer funded by empire, blank space suggested incompetence. So the space was filled, not necessarily with lies, with inference, with extrapolation, with second-hand reports from sailors navigating through fog, with coastlines projected from partial sightings, with islands seen as dusk and recorded as fact. Once recorded, the feature entered the archive, and the archive had authority. After the printing press, errors stopped being local. One respected map became the source of dozens of others, each citing the previous, each reinforcing legitimacy. The phantom was no longer a rumor, it was institutional. In 1798, British geographer James Rennell published the most authoritative map of Africa in Europe. Rennell was credible, Surveyor General of Bengal. Respected by the Royal Society, he had never crossed West Africa's interior. Relying on fragmented traveler accounts, a mountain range appeared on his map. The Mountains of Kong. Drawn as a vast east-west barrier just north of the Gulf of Guinea. They did not exist. The land was savanna, but Rennell's authority carried weight. His engraving circulated across Europe. British maps reproduced the range. French maps copied it. German atlases adopted it. American publishers repeated it. For 70 years, from 1798 to the late 1880s, the mountains of Kong shaped European understanding of West Africa. Exploration routes were altered. Colonial strategy assumed natural barriers. Trade corridors were imagined differently. Administrative logic hardened around terrain drawn in ink. French explorer Louis-Gustave Biget crossed the precise territory. He found flat ground. His report did not immediately erase the mountains. He was one man. The maps were 90 years old. Eventually, the range was removed. But here is the irreversible part. Decisions made under the mountain assumption were not undone. Borders had already been drawn. The mountains of Kong were regional. The Strait of Anian shaped a hemisphere. First appearing on maps in the 1560s, the strait was depicted as a navigable channel connecting the Atlantic and Pacific across North America's northern edge. The logic seemed reasonable. If Asia and America were separate, there must be water between them. The strait was drawn. Expeditions followed. Martin Frobisher searched in the 1570s. He returned with 1,300 tons of rock he believed was gold. It was worthless. Henry Hudson searched in 1610. His crew mutinied. He was cast adrift. James Cook sailed the northern Pacific coast in 1788, seeking confirmation. For 150 years, capital, labor, and lives were routed into ice and fog in pursuit of a passage rendered inevitable by ink. The Northwest Passage technically exists, but the temperate, commercially viable Strait of Anian did not. The expeditions continued because it was on the map. And if it was on the map, it was claimable. And if claimable, rival powers could seize it first. Institutional pressure made absence intolerable. The deeper mechanism is not exploration. It is citation. Consider how errors propagate elsewhere. In medicine, early clinical papers once suggested that stomach ulcers were caused primarily by stress. Textbooks cited the papers, doctors cited the textbooks. Treatment protocols solidified. It took decades before bacterial causes were accepted. The system did not reward contradiction, it rewarded consensus. Cartography operated the same way. A 1572 map shows an island. A 1601 map cites 1572. A 1650 map cites both. a 1700 atlas lists 3 independent confirmations. Except they are not independent. They are the same origin repeated. To remove a phantom, someone had to sail to its coordinates. Find nothing, return, publish, and withstand institutional skepticism. The burden of proof fell on the challenger. Verification was expensive. Citation was cheap. This asymmetry protects error. Not through conspiracy, through efficiency. Every phantom eventually meets reality. James Cook's voyages weakened belief in the Strait of Anian. But correction took years. Binjai's crossing slowly dissolved the mountains of Kong. But colonial lines were already negotiated. In 2012, the Southern Surveyor sailed through Sandy Island. Hydrographic authorities issued a statement. The feature was removed from the record, one administrative line. 136 years undone in a sentence. The island vanished instantly from digital maps. But the claim history remained. The institutional chain that kept it alive had functioned exactly as designed. The most consequential phantom is not an island, it is a border. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European powers partitioned Africa using contemporary maps. Some of those maps still displayed the mountains of Kong. The assumption of natural barriers influenced territorial expectations. Watersheds were misinterpreted. Administrative divisions were imagined around topography that did not exist. By the time the mountains disappeared from atlases, the borders were fixed. When African nations gained independence in the 20th century, those colonial lines became sovereign boundaries. Lines partly informed by a mountain range that never stood. The map did not merely describe territory, it shaped it. The mechanism did not end with parchment. Digital systems still inherit authoritative datasets. Algorithms index prior authority. Databases replicate upstream error at global scale. When a document accumulates enough citation, enough institutional weight, enough embedded decisions, it becomes reality. The explorers who walked flat ground where mountains were drawn had to fight paper. The more uncomfortable question is whether we would do differently. Because the system did not fail. It functioned exactly as it was built. Fill the space, cite the source, move forward.